Let's talk about the phone call you received in the middle of the night that shook your world.
It started off as a normal enough day. I went to work, came home, had dinner with the kids, bath time, bedtime, reading stories, all of that. And then when I was sleeping, I left my phone ringer on because my husband at the time, now my ex-husband, was traveling for work, and just in case he needed to get in touch with us. And the phone rang in the middle of the night and was my stepfather telling me that my mother had been shot.
Life is a big classroom. We learn daily as we journey on. Welcome to another inspiring episode of Podcast with SHEILA, the podcast that spreads positivity around the world by sharing inspiring life experiences. Today's guest is an avid baker, a yogi with 30 years career in banking industry across the continent. Today we are discussing Farah's life experiences together with her mother and daughter relationship memoir. As usual, we aim to motivate, inform, and inspire you. Hello, Farah, and welcome to Podcast.
Hi, Sheila. Thank you so much for having me on your show. Really happy to be here.
Great. So I realized you have an impressive cross-cultural background. Who is Farah?
That's such an interesting question, and I live in Dubai, and because people here are pretty multicultural and come from all parts of the world, that tends to be the first question you get asked anytime you go to any social event. Where do you come from? And it's always such a tricky one for me to answer, so I tend to make light of it. But just for your listeners, I was born in London, and I am of Parsi faith. When I was 4, I was taken to see my maternal grandmother in India, in a small town in northern India. And through a series of circumstances and life situations, my mother chose to remain there. So I grew up in this small town in North India, which is culturally, so India is Hindu predominantly, but the town has a lot of Muslim heritage to it. And then I was sent to school at a Catholic convent out there. So a lot of cultural influences through my childhood and growing up. And then subsequently, I went back to London when I was 18, lived there, worked there, and then moved to Dubai in 2001, and I've been here since. So, citizen of the world, as I tend to sort of make light and make joke, but it feels like I've absorbed a lot of influences.
Great. I believe we're going to learn a lot from you today with the background you have, hopefully. Let's talk about life as a child. What are some of the highlights of that time that led to the woman you are today?
So my childhood, I tend to tinge it as not completely happy, right? Overarching statement. But I think that's a really broad generalization. But if you say highlights, I think what at the time I viewed as potentially not the greatest outcome in terms of growing up in India, which wasn't my choice. London was the home I knew. So when age 4, you're uprooted and taken to another culture without a lot of explanation. I think those days it wasn't about emotional parenting. It was a lot about children are meant to be seen and not heard. So there wasn't any sort of dialogue as to why the circumstances had changed. And I think at the time I was a little bit angry, confused, displaced. I didn't fit in. But as I've grown older, growing up in India was probably a highlight. It's given me my value system. It's given me my love of the culture of India. It's given me the language skills, which opens doors, especially in Dubai, where so much of the population is expatriate and so much of that population is Indian. It really opens ways for me. So I think growing up in India was definitely a highlight, though in hindsight. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, I was very close to her, and that's one of my highlights. My love of cooking, of baking, my love of nature, my knowledge of flowers, my ability or etiquette as a host to host people over. I think I've learned from her and absorbed from her. So definitely another big highlight and a huge portion, a huge influence in my childhood. And then I think just everything around me, the city, the smells, the people, the experiences I had that you couldn't replicate, and you don't learn from a book. Those are life experiences as you go through it. Those would be some of the highlights, I would say.
Wow. I think those ones, nobody can take it away from you. You don't get it in other parts of the world where I want to put it right, but there are certain things you can only get from where you actually come from, and those ones you can't get them anywhere else. Exactly.
That's true of any culture.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. I remember I just met one lady who said she's a South African. As we were talking, I realized she's actually from Ireland, and her parents had gone to work in South Africa and stayed there, and she's grown there, so she sees herself as a South African. Anyway, so I was asking her what are some of the things, now she's relocated to England, and I was asking her what are some of the things she misses back home. And for her, back home is South Africa. Yeah. And I was asking her, and she said bringing her children up in South Africa was something she could never have traded for anything. Was the best part of it for her, because there you could actually train the children up properly, just give them that kind of that they need to grow up. And all her children have turned out very, very well, and she believes she owes a part to the culture back home in South Africa. And those are some of the things we can never ever take away from where we come from. It shapes us up no matter wherever we find ourselves in the world. So let's go on to, I know you've traveled around as a banker a lot on the continent. What are some of these experiences you can share with us as going around or working as a banker on different continents?
So originally I wanted to be a doctor, just for your listeners to hear how life takes you on different journeys. Exactly. So I wanted to be a doctor when I left India and came back to London. But again, through a series of life circumstances, that's not where the universe wanted me to go. So I ended up as a trainee, aged 18 in banking. And I built my career from there. So I started off in London and then moved to Dubai. And in Dubai, I had the opportunity to work in the different Emirates. So Dubai, Abu Dhabi. I also went to the neighboring countries, Bahrain, worked with teams in Saudi, but didn't actually visit them. And then I had the great opportunity to work on some projects that the bank I was working with was leading in Egypt and in Zimbabwe. So I traveled to Zimbabwe and went through South Africa. And it's interesting you were talking about South Africa because my father was born in Johannesburg. Okay. So when I went there and I was in the hotel and they said, "Oh, is it your first time?" And I said, "Yes, my father was born there." And they were like, "Welcome back to the land of your fathers." And I thought that was such a lovely way to describe it. But it's culturally, each place has a very different footprint. London, the culture is very corporate, professional. Everyone's busy. It's a busy life in London, right? Or in England, and everyone's moving around. In UAE, it's a little bit of a different culture. Plus, you're dealing with individuals who've come from different countries and bring their own work experience or corporate experience. So it's also about navigating the nuances of that cultural differences that exist and trying to understand the point of view of the other person. And given the fact that I already had some of these influences growing up, it was a little bit easier to navigate. Egypt, very, very different emotional landscape. The Egyptians, the culture, the noise, the bustle, just the general way the country operates tells you how the people are operating. And in Zimbabwe, means gorgeous people, gorgeous souls, but the country is so ravaged by everything that's happened in there, and yet the people remain the gentlest and the kindest that I met. And I love the country and the people that I met there. So each place really different, but if you're attuned to what's going on around you and you use your emotional intelligence to read the room and see what's going on, it stands you in good stead and you're able to navigate and not be so rigid in your own point of view. It helps ease the transition of working in different countries.
Wow, beautiful. You put it so beautifully, and I like that. What was your relationship with your mom like growing up? And what were some of the lessons you learned from her that shaped you into the woman you are today?
So my relationship, I think, I'm going to say pretty typical of most parent-child, right? It goes through a bit of a journey, and I base this on my experience with my own children. Children, great before they learn the word no, and then they become teenagers, and then no is the only word they say. So as a teenager, I probably was a bit of a difficult one, and especially because my parents were divorced. Mum was the only parent, so if there was any acting out, it was at her. There was no one else to absorb anything that I was feeling. When I was 18, I moved to London, so that changed the dynamic of our relationship, and I was becoming independent. We were speaking as friends more than mother and child. And then when I had my own children, it really sort of brought home that whole, I saw her and her life choices and her as the mother to me when I experienced motherhood myself. Some of the key things I would say, or the key values my mom stood for, was standing up for what was right, regardless of personal circumstances, or regardless of what might happen in terms of consequences. My colleagues tease me today. They're like, "Does the no filter come from my mom?" And I think it does. Speaking up when you think or speaking up for fair play, or speaking up for the underdog. Right? That was a big part of who she was, and that's something I've taken with me. I don't know if she had this huge personality and love of life and love of socializing. I'm not quite the same. I'm probably more the opposite side of it. I'm quite, I was going to say, not unsocial, but my core group is smaller, whereas Mum had a huge core group. But she had this love of life, love of food, which I adore, love of entertaining, which I've taken, and it's passed down from my grandmother to my mother to me. My mother had a love of fashion and style, and just artifacts and anything pretty, and I think that she's passed on to me as well. So I'd like to think that there are aspects of her that have come through, but she was such a big personality that it would be hard to emulate that.
Let's talk about the phone call you received in the middle of the night that shook your world.
So again, life changes on a dime, right? We think everything's going fine, and one phone call, one email today, one post, and everything changes. It was started off as a normal enough day. I went to work, came home, had dinner with the kids, bath time, bedtime, reading stories, all of that. And then when I was sleeping, I left my phone ringer on because my husband at the time, now my ex-husband, was traveling for work, and just in case he needed to get in touch with us. And the phone rang in the middle of the night, and was my stepfather telling me that my mother had been shot. So in the town where we grew up, it was a question of wrong place, wrong time, and there were some youths out on the street. And in India, there's this thing called eve teasing, where they make lewd comments at ladies or girls, and it's generally sexual. It's sexual innuendo, suggestion, just harassment, right? And my mom witnessed and stood up for what she believed was right and asked them to apologize, and that didn't end so well. And so she was shot that night. And then it was a question of, how do I get to her? Because I was in Dubai, she was in India. And then the next day was just a blur in terms of planning and trying to get to her. And everyone just kept calling me because they felt I might not get there in time, and they feared that she might pass before I got to see her. But luckily I got there, and she survived for a number of days, as I hope your listeners will read and share the story and the journey.
Whoa. What was the experience like between the moment you received the call and when you arrived at the hospital?
I think your brain listens to the information, but you haven't fully absorbed it, or you're not able to, it hasn't really hit you, I think. So the brain saying, okay, there's an accident, but nowhere was the brain saying, Mom's not going to survive. That didn't come into the picture for me at the time, initially. And it was a question of, okay, I need to book a flight, and I need to pack, and, I'm leaving the kids, and my husband had to come back, and logistics and hand over work. Get to the airport, and you get on the plane, and that's perhaps the first moment you're sitting with yourself and your thoughts, and you're going through the ramifications or, worst case scenarios in your head. But at the same time, I wasn't willing to accept anything other than she'd be fine. It was an accident and she'd be okay. And then when you get to the hospital, everyone was there, friends, family, the reporters outside. It was, a big crowd. And you walk in and you see everyone and everyone's crying and, they're hushed tones and the doctors are consulting each other and they're huddles and people are hugging you as you're walking up to see her to prepare you for what you're going to see. But I don't think anything really prepares you to see the parent that the strong parent lying in a bed, strapped to every machine known to mankind. And that's when it really lands that, oh my God, this is, really serious. And I'm just glad I was there.
Wow. I think a loss of any kind is difficult to deal with. I've dealt with a number of losses in my lifetime. I think the recent one was when I lost my dad right after COVID. He didn't get COVID. He had been sick later on my brother said he's been sick for over 10 years. We didn't know it's been that long. And then finally he passed away. The day I had the call, it was late at night as well. And I think I was just having a cup of tea just before I retired to bed. And I was boiling the kettle, the kettle was on boiling, and I had a call from him. I wasn't expecting to hear that. And then he just gave it to me. I think,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, the thing I could do was just to scream. And my son woke up and came downstairs. Mommy, are you okay? And I said, yes, I am. But, for that moment, the shock alone. And when I sit down to think about it, every time it gets to me, that kind of thing. And it's difficult to deal with pain. How were you able to deal?
I'm really sorry for your loss.
No, that's fine. How were you able to deal with your pain?
So people say, how do you get over it? But I don't think you actually get over it. You just figure out how to deal with it, right? And there's a void left, especially by a parent, because they're such a big part of our life, that find ways to navigate around it and just find ways, like if I miss the sound of my mom's voice, or if something great happens and I want to call her, now she's not there, how do I deal with it? Either I internalize it, or I might call one of her really close friends and hear their voice as a substitute for my mother's voice. It took a long time. There's no one way to deal with grief. You might have yelled when you heard the news. I might not have. Other people might do it different. But I think you find, so I came back and I had all of this emotion and I didn't know what to do with it, and I wasn't with my family in India. I'd come back to Dubai and I was going to work and I was going through the motions, but I was sort of enveloped by this, cloak of grief, and I didn't know how to shift it. So I went for counseling, and the counselor made me write my emotions and how do I feel, and she used to keep, how do you feel, and write more and go a level deeper. I did, pretty much any modality that people would recommend to me. I went for breath work, I went for hypnotherapy, I went, anything that I thought might help me release the grief. And I wasn't ready to let go of the memory of my mom, but I had to let the grief go. And, I'd always practiced some form of exercise, or like fairly active, but yoga became a very big part of that journey. It was a place where I could bring my mind to center, and my body was getting stronger through the practice. And it just helped you be a little bit more prepared for whatever life was throwing at you. I was baking a lot. Like, baking is, I find, quite creative and therapeutic. I would just enter the kitchen, take out ingredients, start baking something. I'm not quite sure why I felt it would help, but it was just something I was called to do. And for a minute, it switches off your mind because you're focused on weighing the ingredients, making sure the oven's at the right temperature, how long do I have, that kind of stuff. So your negative thoughts pause for a minute. So it took a really long time for me to be able to still have the memory of mom and smile at some of the memories, but not get so choked up every time I think of her. Not to say that you ever get over the loss of a parent, I feel.
I think I've seen a post on Instagram that says that anytime you're going through some form of emotions and you do something with your hands, because our hands are, there's some nerves with our hands that are connected to our brains that releases some happy chemicals in our brains, and that is where it says that craft is therapeutic. So that is where it comes in. So anytime you're down and you pick up something to do, it could be anything, but it has to be something that you're doing with your hands. So it could be, like you said, baking, any form of craft, sewing, embroidery, anything that engages your fingers, your hands. It causes some nerves in your brains to release happy chemicals, and then you see that it revives you. And that is where, and I think so many times a few of our guests, or a number of our guests who have been on podcast with Sheila, had said things in that line as to prove that craft is therapeutic. And so that is something that we are throwing out there to say that we've tried it and it's worked. Because I tried all the time. I tried, and it goes to prove that it really does work. Let's talk about your biggest takeaway from, is it Meher and me?
Meher, yeah.
Meher and me. Yeah. What is the biggest takeaway for our listeners? What should they expect if they should get the book? What should they expect to take away from reading your book?
I hope they enjoy the read. I really hope they enjoy reading what's written. I hope they take away that adversity comes to all of us. I don't think any of us get a free pass, right? All of us are going to have challenges, but with a little bit of grit and determination and hard work, you can rise above whatever your beginning was, whatever your start was. You can come out the other side. If you can dream it, you can make it happen. And loss is something that all of us will experience at some level, right, through our lives. And there are ways that you can handle it, and you just have to find the tools that support you and help you and your support network, and you'll come out okay. You will come out okay.
Just before we wrap up on that, I think there are two questions I left out. Did the loss of your mom impact your life in any way?
It's a loss, and it leaves a empty space. Yeah. And because I didn't have a relationship with my dad, she was my only parent. So it's a huge gaping hole that remains empty. It's not something that anyone else can fill. So yeah, big loss.
Did you think she not being around in your life, and you never had a dad figure in your life? Did you have a dad figure at some point in your life? No.
Not really.
So going through all of that, obviously it would have been a bigger gap, but how was the feeling like? Recently I had read a memoir of another lady, and she never got to meet her dad, and the mom presented to her as her dad eventually wasn't her dad in the end. And she's 35 years old now, still looking for her dad, and she had to put it in a memoir. And she's an African woman, so our African culture and all that. There's been a lot of backlash saying it was wrong for her to have put her mom in that light. But this is a young lady still looking for her dad, because she said growing up she's seen the relationship other children have with their dad, and she's always longed for that, and she wants to still have it. Even if she's old, she still wants to have that relationship, and she's been asking her mom about this for years. Now she feels the only thing possible is to put it in a book. Maybe he'll see it, read it, and want to look. What was the feeling like? Because obviously if mom was in there, you would expect your dad to be, or someone else to step in. Now at this point you don't have both. How have you dealt with it?
I think it's one of those things, again, it's a loss, right? It's a loss of a parent figure. So it starts with mom and dad separating and then eventually divorcing. And in theory, one would say the father doesn't have to get distant from the child. The father can still maintain a relationship with the child, but my father chose not to. And he's never been there for us, be it financially or emotionally, let alone physically, right? And when mom passed, we reached out to him to let him know, and again, there wasn't the emotional support that one might hope would be there. I think what I've had to learn, and I completely echo what your other podcast guest was saying, I growing up, remember very distinctly sitting somewhere and seeing a friend sitting in her dad's lap and the dad's arms around her, and really wishing I could have that, but not able to verbalize it. Because as a child, it's almost like saying, I don't have what you have, and it's almost like a form of envy or jealousy. And as a child, what you have, you believe is normal, right? But that longing remained. And I think I've just had to learn to be self-sufficient. Like, I have to meet my own emotional needs. I have to meet my own financial needs. I have to meet my own any other need. And I think parenting myself, or just being able to fend for myself in most situations, is a repeated life lesson. So it's one that I'm learning, sometimes a little reluctantly, but it's there, and I can't change that reality. So you just have to work with what it is.
Yeah. Do you think there's something we can put out to all the fathers who may be listening and who have, for some reason, one reason or the other, have not been in the lives of their children, which may not be any fault of the children's? What can we say to them? Because growing up, I think recently, as I was talking about this story I just narrated, I was having a chat with my husband. I was telling him my father being in the house was one big opportunity I could never have, because when my dad came on pension, the things he used to do was, my son asked me this morning, he would read his newspaper, he would listen to the news, and he had a flower garden, and the flower garden was in front of the house, and it was 3 of us girls and my brother. Now, as we grew up, anytime we walked past him to go out, I have it at the back of my mind, he's sitting there, and when I'm coming back, he'll be sitting there. I cannot go and mess up out there, because I'm going to think he's going to see through me, kind of, that kind of thing. He'll know what you went to do. So that checked me. It put me on the straight and narrow. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that. Those are some of the things unknowingly shapes our life when we have such figures in our lives. What can we tell some of these fathers? Maybe some of them may have taken their position for granted, thinking that the woman can do it. And most of the women are doing brilliant jobs, but we still need a man at home. What can we tell them?
I think it's really, really sad. Like, I had to figure out how a dry shaver works with my son when he needed to shave his beard. But the things that the father can give, just by being present, that male energy, that male role model, because the man is the blueprint for the young gentleman, and the man is the blueprint for the husband the young girls are going to seek in their future lives. And by not being present, you're depriving the kids of an experience and a role model and just that energy. And I kind of feel the losses on both sides, yes, for the children, but also these fathers, like, emotionally you've abandoned someone, right? So you're acting out, either it happened to them or they're not healed from some childhood trauma, and they're placing that debt on their kids in a way that's going to keep perpetuating unless someone figures it out. And I read recently, you were talking about posts, someone said, why do we call it single moms? We should just say they're absentee dads. Like, the mom is holding the fort and doing everything. It's the dad who's absent. So why is the label on the woman who's doing it all herself? And it's almost like a stigma. Hopefully raised healthy, emotionally secure children without any support from these so-called fathers who just abandon their families. And 9 times out of 10, they go and set up home somewhere else in the hope that they'll do better. And, that's not always the outcome. So, it's really sad. It's really sad. So all those dads, I think you should get in touch with your kids and make better, do better, and do better by these children, because they didn't ask to be treated like this. And the dad's the adult and should know that they can do better.
Exactly. What will your ultimate future dream be? I read about it, but I want you to tell us.
Well, I mentioned I bake a lot, right? So I'm hoping one day I will have a cafe of my own. I'd love to have a cafe on the beach is my dream, with maybe a yoga studio attached to it or above it or somewhere in the vicinity. That would be a really nice dream to make come true.
Wow. We pray that your dream really does come true. What will your final message be to our listeners as we finally wrap up?
Thank you for having me on your show, and I hope your listeners enjoy our conversation. I think all of us we come into this life to learn something, right? And challenges are thrown at us, but with a few tools, if we figure it out, we can master whatever life's throwing at us and come out stronger and become the people that we are today. Listening to this podcast, I'm sure everyone's come through some sort of challenge and emerged stronger. So I think just keep the faith, go through it, and it'll all work out in the end.
Sure, it will work out in the end. We would like to say a massive thank you, Farah, for coming on Podcast with Sheila today.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Thanks for having me on.
Great. If you've been listening in, this is season 2, episode 87 of our podcast series, where we bring seasoned guests with inspiring real life stories and experiences to share with us. Do not miss out on all these lovely experiences. Subscribe and be notified when a new episode is released. Whilst at it, please drop us a rating. We have a video presentation of this episode on our YouTube channel. Just search for Podcast with Sheila on YouTube and you'll find us. Our prayer for you this week is that you never give up when you're going through challenges. Together, we will make the world a better place. Until we meet again, have a brilliant week.